This is on the list of things we were asked to look at this year, a bit of a break from my normal sort of ambulance related stuff. Um, and what we wanted to look at was things related to the reality of risk as opposed to, how to do remote or expedition medicine. This related to risk mitigation and to go into things with your eyes wide open if you're contemplating this as a part of a portfolio career or as your full-time job, then I think it's always best to go into things learning from the experience of others. So if you're ready to make a start, it's grown into quite a monster. This as I added more and more to it. So let's see where it takes us. So yeah, I think to recognise in this is that although most of you might know me as a slightly old, fat ambulance driver, once upon a time I was a younger, thinner ambulance driver. And prior to that, worked in the outdoor industry. And when I became paramedic, then I found a way I could use both sets of skills. So all these pictures of places I've been in the world, and all the pictures in the presentation are mine. So there is no library pictures in here. So this is why I can sort of talk about this subject a little bit. And I think we have to have a word of caution right at the start. There's a huge amount of talks out there and a huge amount of courses about remote and expedition medicine. It's very popular amongst aspiring clinicians, particularly those relatively junior in their career. But as with all education around such things and all learning, I think it's really quite important to recognise the background and experience of the person who might be teaching you. It's quite common on courses to find that the only experience the people that are teaching you got is they've done the course, and they've rarely done anything outside of their normal clinical role, or maybe worked on a single event or something like that. Um, Also common to see people with little recent hands-on clinical experience. So important to recognise that current clinical experience is important as well as the specialism that is remote or expedition medicine. And some people even work in full-time roles and that sort of thing. If they work in very strictly controlled environments, don't often see many patients. So as ever, if we get squeeze a little bit of Latin in there, caveat emptor, buyer beware. Be careful what you listen to. Be careful what you learn. So let's set down some definitions. And I thought it was good to start with some definitions of, the extremes of the risk we might see here. And then we're separating out here really remote from expedition. There's a lot of remote sites, but the picture top left is an Italian-ran gas field in the Sahara Desert, and it's probably one of the nicest places I've ever been to. It's had a beautiful gym and a swimming pool and Italian chefs and five-star accommodation and the most wonderful facilities and mobile phones and internet and everything you could possibly want. So whilst it was definitely remote in the middle of the Sahara Desert with its own airstrip, it was far from sparse and very well equipped. Or you could be out in the middle of nowhere, on a desert island, as the picture on the right, which was a TV show. And Rod, that is watching tonight, was on that island with me. And we can't say any more than that because we'd probably get in trouble. And then from that, we might decide, what sort of funding does this thing have? That's going to affect everything, isn't it? All the way from a expedition sponsored by a motor manufacturer where the budget will run to millions and millions of pounds, to something much more lower key with small numbers of people, running on a slightly different budget. So there's going to be a lot of decision making within that sort of budget expectations of the event and how it's being ran. So this talk isn't really about the exciting places I've been. It'd be very easy to talk about that, and wants to hear about that. I can talk about it for hours. But it's about reality of risk if you're looking to get this into a clinician. Understanding the risk and then appreciating how much risk you're, willing to entertain. and how much risk are you taking on professionally. So I think it's really important to recognize that. And it's certainly from something that I've learned over the years. So yeah, I mean, if you're very new to being a clinician, you're relatively new in your career, and you generally work under supervision, then I guess one of the things you have to consider is, despite the number of years you might have spent at university and the uh, clinical workload that you take on, the responsibility you have, particularly from those from a ambulance background where they're not directly supervised, and are out making their own autonomous decisions. But it is part of a larger system. So I guess you also there's a question where you have to ask, is it appropriate for me to work without supervision in one form of another, in an unsupervised setting? So that's a question you've got to consider, because that's where you might find yourself. And then the next few slides are really about what are we used to versus what you might face in a sort of remote or expedition setting. We're very used to having a lot of resources in the UK. Yeah, so this is what you're used to working on ambulance, community responders, specialist resources, more ambulances as backup, critical care teams, etc., etc. If that's what you're used to, then that's a big step to something like this, where that is all your medical kit and you in the middle of nowhere, and that's you. Yeah, so that's a big change. Likewise, if you're used to having a lot of other specialist resources, the other emergency services and specialist divisions we work with, from Heart, Mountain Rescue, Cave Rescue, RNLI, Coast Guard, search and rescue teams, police, fire, etc. All these things that are there to support us and work around us, and provide specialist input for us, probably aren't there. We could find ourselves facing a severely injured casualty. This is simulation, I'd point out. Severely injured casualty, and there's just us. And that's it, and we're on our own, and no one else is coming immediately. If we're used to having access to large resources, we have a major trauma network in the UK now, and in the majority of places in England, you're within an hour or maybe a little bit more to a major trauma centre. And that's, having access to that facility is amazing. But if that's what you're used to, are you ready for this? This was a government hospital in an African city. And yeah, that was pretty much the state of it. Yeah, it was it had intermittent electricity and very little medical supplies. And it did have a lovely intensive care unit, which had been donated by a Japanese charity. Unfortunately, it was all in boxes because they had no building to put it in, and no one that knew how to set it up. And we're used to a lot of team members around us, yeah, and specialist input and being able to access specialist care. As I've alluded to already, what that might become is just you. And you are a long way from anywhere. Yeah, and this was a view that we had when I was working out of Mongolia with a motor manufacturer. And the view from this mountain was so big you could see the curvature of the earth, which was quite impressive. So what are the other risks that we're going to face? I guess one of the questions is, if you're not in the UK, am I even a medic here? And I saw some social media posts recently about some paramedics that were working on things in Europe, and I was like, that's great, I've done that. I wonder if they've realized they're no longer a paramedic, because in the country they're in, they're not registered to be a paramedic. In fact, there isn't paramedics in that country. They don't exist. Now, in the remote medical world, this is a widely sort of accepted practice. Yeah, that other healthcare professionals will work in other countries. Yeah, but certainly from the sort of paramedic side, not all countries have paramedics. Some countries don't even have an ambulance service. Yeah, so you may not be recognised from there. I certainly remember following one of my doctor colleagues through an immigration checkpoint in a part of the world where they were sort of asking him why he was here, and he said doctor, and they waved him through. And then I came up behind him, and he said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Paramedic," and they looked at me blankly, and I said, "Ambulance." They looked at me blankly, so I said, "Apologies to everyone, doctor," and they went, "Oh, wave you through." Yeah, yeah, because That was all they understood. Yeah, and they didn't understand that other healthcare professionals. You have to consider that in that country there might be legal issues around you practicing there because you're not actually the thing you are here in the UK. Although say there is some wide use of that sort of equivalency, etc. Are other things legal here or safe or possible? Yeah. How much fluid can we carry in a remote area? Yeah, it's heavy. Yeah. And if it's cold, it'll freeze. Yeah. So you can't take it anywhere that's really, really cold. It's very, very hard to protect unless you've got a way of, warming it back up, etc., which probably isn't the way. Yeah, we probably can't carry, specialist products like blood. So I see quite a lot of move towards sort of new products like freeze-dried plasma, like Lyoplast, which is definitely a possibility because it doesn't need to be kept in such a strict temperature range and it's got a good life. We have to be careful at what we're carrying in many Middle Eastern countries. Any form of opiates, including codeine tablets, are strictly illegal. You might as well enter with a pound of heroin because they're not permitted. So you've got to be very careful what you transit through other countries with. But controversially, when I was working for the UN out in Somalia, and some of our ketamine ampoules got smashed, then we sent our driver down to the pharmacy with ketamine written on a bit of paper and a handful of cash, and he came back with a box of ketamine. Because there is no prescription rules. So the taxi driver went and fetched us some because I was got smashed by some baggage handlers when we are doing a flight. There is some provisions in the UK. So the Home Office Controlled Drugs Unit do have a document, a license that permits healthcare professionals to take legally held controlled drugs in the UK out and back in again for expedition purposes. It originally said doctors, although when I did some work with them about controlled drugs licensing back in the sort of mid 2000s, I actually got the controlled drugs unit to add the word paramedics into that document as well. So it became legal for us to do the same. But of course, that may not apply at the other end. When you arrive in another country with your big bag of controlled drugs, then is it legal to have them there? Are you licensed to have them there? Certainly on well-funded expeditions. I was once the owner of a Mongolian controlled drugs license in Mongolian that I could present, but certainly it may cause complications if you go to other places. Yeah, and we mentioned the climate. Yeah, is your fluid going to turn into a giant lollipop? Yeah, what happens when you freeze glass vials? Well, the liquid inside them will expand and it will track the vials. Yeah, so if you're talking about super cold climates and we did some of the polar stuff, then actually liquid stuff may not be practical at all. And in fact, most of the medications we carried was in tablet form because the liquid stuff we just couldn't look after well enough to keep it probably even in one piece, much less any usable state. And if you're traveling with all this stuff, then sometimes it's best to present in the right way. So certainly when we used to travel with a lot of medical supplies and drugs, we often used to travel in our sort of work uniform to make it a bit more sort of reasonable. That we had in the hold luggage, we had massive big North Face bags full of medicines and medical supplies. But there might be a downside to that, as this was a flight I was on out to the Middle East and ended up doing a cardiac arrest on an airliner because the crew went, "Oh, medical person," yeah, and ended up managing a cardiac arrest on a plane. But yeah, we used to find that going through sort of customs and immigration, it made it far easier rather than looking like some sort of just scruffy person turning up with loads of drugs and needles and things. If you're in a place, and obviously you'll have a visa to be there or permission to be there, but what if you need to medevac someone out of that country and you're not coming back to Europe? Although we don't have easy access to Europe anymore now, but what if you need to go out of one country into another country? Do you have a visa to go there? Can you, do you have the right to enter that country, even to do a medevac or to cross the border? And the fact it's an emergency might not bother that country. There's plenty of places that wouldn't permit that. And likewise, can your patient? Certainly, we've had cases where we couldn't take patients into certain countries because either they didn't have a passport because they were a local, or their country next door didn't get on with their country, and therefore you couldn't medevac them there, whatever the medical need. They just wouldn't take them. Yeah, so you've got to have a consideration of what's possible. You need to measure risk. Yeah, where is your line of personal safety? And this is your own dynamic risk assessment and comfort zone. And we've got extremes there from top left, the back streets of Kabul in Afghanistan, and how safe do you feel driving around there? Yeah, versus I think we're at sort of the top end of that bottom right picture. We're at 14, 15,000 feet in the Austrian Alps, making a TV show, and how comfortable you are in that environment, and having to deal with the altitude and everything else that comes with that. So, just an exact example of the sort of evacuations you might be faced by and the complexities of these things. We were in the Gobi Desert with a motor manufacturer, and if there was at the time no Western standard hospitals in the country in Mongolia, there was a small international run clinic, which was excellent, but was just that, like a minor injuries, sort of a primary care clinic. So if we wanted to get from the Gobi Desert where we were to a Western standard hospital, then we were faced with daytime only flying from only two landing sites, which was an hour each way in our own plane, a leased plane, but that was very limited by bad weather, sandstorms, etc. And like many parts of the world, daylight flying only. And we had to move the patient to the capital because only the capital had a paved runway, and medevac jets can only generally land on paved runways because the jet engines on most commercial planes don't like gravel. Uh, so, uh, and if we couldn't do that with our own plane, then it was about a 24-hour drive back to the capital with the patient, and we would have taken two vehicles, one with us and the patient in, and the other one full of diesel. But even when we got to the capital, then we needed the IOSOS jet from Beijing, and that would have taken the patients to Seoul in South Korea. Beijing was closer, but taking patients into China and then getting their relatives into China is politically far more difficult. So our plan involves going that little bit further to South Korea, where there wouldn't be a problem. That's about 3 hours flight. But say the medevac jet couldn't come to where we were, even though there was an airport because of the gravel runways. But that's plus all the calling time, planning, insurance availability, logistics time, etc. So you can be faced by very, very long evacuation chains, and that has to be entirely in your plan. And this was high risk flying, even in our own leased aircraft. This was the airport fire engine that some days appeared and some days didn't. And I didn't know whether any of the firefighters had been trained or whether they just had this fire engine the Russians had left behind. We were forbidden by the insurers to use any Mongolian fixed or rotary wing assets due to their horrific safety record. Basically, they thought it was that bad that if we put a casualty in one of their helicopters, the chances are a helicopter crash and we'd all die. We were very much limited as how we were permitted to travel. And of course, you could be really a long way out. This is out on the sea ice north of Canada. This is remote ice landing aircraft only beyond the range of the Coast Guard helicopter. So plane is the only way to get to you. And that's obviously very daylight dependent, again, like almost everywhere, and weather dependent. Up towards the end of this polar race, there was a whole week when we had no available flights. We had 3 days of storms, and then at the other end, where the airplanes lived, there was 3 days of storms. So for 6+ days, there was no possibility of a flight to get to us. So we were very much on our own, and that was that. So what now? We've talked about some of the risk. Yeah, so how can we mitigate some of that risk? And that, of course, is everything to do with risk management, isn't it? Identifying risk and then mitigating it. So what can we do? And sometimes you say, well, it's all fine. We've got travel insurance. We've got travel insurance that covers all activities. and everything else, and we're well insured, and everything's fine. The trouble is, most travel insurance cannot provide immediate help, and if it does, generally they'll only try and help to get you to the closest possible facility. Remembering that the job of insurance companies is to collect money, not to pay it out. Otherwise, they wouldn't make any money. Yeah, so even most travel insurance is quite limited, particularly in very expensive places. To arrange a medevac can take usually days. Yeah, while they review your case, try and dodge it a bit, pass it back and forth through their doctor, who's being paid to not authorize medevacs, and there's a lot of money involved. If we'd have used a medevac flight from Mongolia to South Korea, it was quoted at the time as $55,000 for a single patient flight. So, in reality, to make sure you're well covered for this, if you think you might be in a situation where you may want to order a medevac fairly, urgently, and accepting that that's got to depend on pilot availability, aircraft availability, the time it takes them to get the flight plan in place, come all the way to you for you to get to where you can meet them, etc., to expedite that process and get the plane launched as soon as possible. You probably need to have other plans other than insurance. Certainly, when we worked on well-funded expeditions, it wasn't uncommon for us to carry 100,000 US dollars in cash for buying stuff locally if we needed to. Yeah, and for paying for medical care locally, which is nearly all in cash. Yeah, and upfront. Yeah, there's no get treated in the hospital and then we'll post you the bill. It doesn't work that way. It's like you need an operation that's going to be $30,000. You need to pay it now before the operation. And most medevac companies want all the money in their escrow account, so in their sort of standby account. So if it's going to cost you $55,000 to get a medevac plane in, they want $55,000 in their account before they'll start to plan the flight. Yeah, not a promise from an insurance company or whatever. They want the money in their account. That's their security. Yeah. So on some of the well-funded stuff we did, not only did we have a huge amount of cash, but we were also issued by the client with a black American Express card that had no limit on, and we were given the instruction that if you need to order a medevac, you pay with the card. We'll fight with the insurance company after. Yeah, because that they knew the insurance company wouldn't cooperate in a rapid way. In order to do that from a remote place, you might need communications. Yeah. So, whatever your phone provider tells you in our experience, sometimes your phone won't work in other countries. They don't always roam when they're supposed to. And sometimes we sell our old mobile phone systems to other countries and they're older technology that isn't really compatible anymore. So, local SIMs are fairly common. Or local phones even. We went to places where we had to go and buy a local phone with a local SIM to get mobile phone connection. Although it's amazing in some countries how good the mobile phone network is because they don't have landline phones. So they have some pretty incredible mobile phone networks in some places. You wouldn't expect it. And if we were thinking we might transit through areas, they're pretty uncommon here, but they're really easy to buy. You get phones that take dual or even triple SIMs. So we used to have multiple SIM cards for the different zones we might go into. So it meant that we could keep in touch. We generally also had satellite phones as well, but satellite phones only work usually where they can see the southern horizon, depending on which network you're on, whether it's their equatorial satellites or a bigger network. And even GPS can be quite poor when you get up to the polar regions. On the polar race, we even had trouble locating ourselves where we wanted to be some of the times because the GPS would go really screwy because it wouldn't pick up many satellites. Remote internet can be really handy. That's a BGAN type device on the right there, and they work really well, but they're quite slow. The other thing you have to remember is in some countries, being in possession of these devices is often a criminal offence in itself. Yeah, because they consider them weapons of spying. Yeah, so things like satellite phones, BGANs, even GPS units in some countries, you can't enter with because they'll, at the very best, take them off you, but sometimes they'll refuse you entry at the airport and send you back home because they consider them to be inappropriate items. And of course, one risk mitigation would be suitable training. Yeah, as we said right at the start, use a specialist provider that has external qualifications, backed by, a suitable specialist body. This is one of the organisations that I've worked with for the past, and at least one of the people from there is listening today. And they're all associates of mine, but they're a good example of a company that specialises in remote medical care taught by people that have been remote medics. Obviously, as the BBC would say, other providers are available. But ask about the people teaching you. And I always say this about all, education, all pre-hospital and medical education. Ask about the people teaching you. What's their background? What's their patient contact currency? What qualifications have they got? I remember learning occurs with the right education, not necessarily the right simulation. There was a trend in pre-hospital care currently for the most amazing simulation using super expensive mannequins and projected simulation suites and all sorts of clever stuff. But if the educators aren't any good, then you're just going to watch a really nice movie. Only do regulated or well-formulated, peer-reviewed, multidisciplinary team courses. Anything else could just be someone else's opinion. And be realistic about the scope you can take on. If you're a healthcare professional with a wide scope already and the capacity to cope with complex clinical thinking, then it might be appropriate to take on a bigger scope. But bear in mind, you're going to be outside of your normal sphere of experience. So how much can you do? So I think very much it's important to recognize what's valuable and what isn't and how much you can take on. There is a lot of scope nowadays in very advanced sort of remote medicine courses and prolonged care courses and all sorts of clever and fancy stuff. But unless you're used to doing those things in a normal practice, you can adapt the skills you have, but it's very hard to learn something, on a few days course and then be a proficient provider. And if something goes wrong, can you prove you're qualified to be there? Yeah, if you trained as a paramedic at a university in the UK, and then worked on an ambulance in the UK, and then go to be a remote medic somewhere, something goes wrong, how are you going to evidence that you have suitable training and experience? So you need to make sure you've got that. How much weight and volume of kit can you take? We're used to having lots. I mean, we have to have a C1 license to drive our ambulances because we fill them up full of so much shit. Yeah, there's a mountain of stuff on them, everything you could possibly want. Yeah, so weight and volume of kit is not a problem. But wherever you're traveling, be it vehicle based or foot based or whatever, there's always going to be some form of greater limitation unless you're on a fixed site. Yeah, so things you've got to consider, and some of those can be really useful. Extra skills and be practiced at doing them in your own clinical setting. One of the things that we did many years ago is we actually went on a course to learn how to do plaster casts, and it wasn't because we wanted to be able to put plaster casts on people and that be their final clinical pathway. It's because we figured out that Benicast, the sort of ready to use add water plaster cast material, is smaller and lighter than carrying lots of splints. So rather than having to carry vacuum splints, box splints, and every other splint you can imagine, we could carry one bag with plaster cast in and just make a temporary cast. So it was cost and weight saving, as well as being very practical. If you have diagnostics, can you carry them? Yeah, so great to have an all-in monitor and all that sort of stuff, but they're really heavy and quite reasonably fragile. So they've got to be packed in a super tough case to carry it in. That makes it heavier and takes up more space. And if you're in a vehicle-based setting, that might be fine. But otherwise, yeah, you may have to look at suitable alternatives. And most of these things also need charging, and you might not have power or reliable power. So then battery-powered things using good batteries suddenly become more attractive. Something you can change the batteries in. Sure, you can buy AA and AAA batteries anywhere in the world, so that makes it easier. But if you're going to use small items, use quality ones. If you're going to use a finger pulse oximeter, it should be one that costs a couple of £100, not one that costs $5.99 off eBay, because we know how well made and how reliable it will be. Yeah, so if you're going to use stuff, it needs to be good stuff. But if you're in a really cold place, then probably nothing will work. Yeah, because the cold will just kill the batteries, and they're really, really hard to use. Yeah, and the more battery hungry they are, the less they'll like the cold. So yeah, some of this stuff can be very clever. And also some of it, some of it requires the internet. That's something you have to look out for as well. Certainly we had some EPOC type machines, some portable blood testing machines that needed software updates every week. And if you didn't do the software update, it would stop working. So therefore the thing had to be connected to the internet every week. Yeah, which wasn't very helpful. Yeah, so some of these things sound great, but you need power and internet quite commonly. Now we know even in the event medicine market in the UK, it's quite unregulated, and there's a bottom end sort of cesspit of care in there somewhere. Yeah, and along with some truly excellent providers. Yeah, but probably remote or expedition medicine outside of the oil and gas industry, which is um, generally regulated if it's a UK associated company by the sort of HSE guidelines, although those were generally written for offshore North Sea platforms. No one's ever rewritten the regulations for land-based sites, which are by far the vast majority nowadays. But otherwise, there's very little regulation. What we have to remember is that we inherit some responsibility, particularly if we're a healthcare professional. The fact you're a volunteer doesn't matter, and you should never try and pretend to be the hidden medic. Never go on an expedition as a participant with an agreement you'll be the medic. Yeah, 'cause if they know you're a medic and you've agreed to be the medic if needed, then you inherit the professional responsibility. Be cautious if you go and work with someone in a remote or expedition role. Yeah, do your due diligence. If they don't have the knowledge systems, policies, governance, and everything else, do they have appropriate medical direction? Is there some form of top cover or reach back system for you to get expert advice? Because you can't take the patient to the local major trauma center and be faced by 40 experts. Where are you going to get that expert advice from? And do they have the necessary insurance? Yeah. Do they have the necessary cash? Do they have the necessary support to supply a medevac when you want one? Or it's going to go, well, we can't do that. You'd have to get the expedition members insurance to try and get it. And that really isn't going to wash. What we should always remember is the death of UK citizens anywhere in the world, even in the military setting nowadays, is governed by the UK coroner. And a UK standard of care, given some lenience for the circumstances, will be expected. Yeah, not in I didn't have a double crewed ambulance and whatever, but what care is reasonable to provide in the circumstances should be to a standard that would meet that standard of care in the UK. You can't go, well, if I was in the UK, I'd do this, but we didn't bring that drug. So, because we're not in the UK, that probably won't cut it. Anywhere that says just take along any medical kit you have probably should make you suspicious. Yeah, a well outfitted operation should be all over that. Be careful about charity events. Yeah, sometimes there's a drive to keep costs down, and and there's absolutely nothing wrong with volunteering to work with such a thing. I do a lot of volunteering in my life. Yeah, but being a volunteer doesn't lead to a lower standard of care or a lower standard of provision. If it seems too good to be true, maybe think about walking away from something you've been offered that seems really exciting. Yeah. In the past, I've been an advisor to both GMC and HCPC cases involving remote medicine, where the clinician has ended up in trouble because of how something went wrong. We mentioned there's probably no fire service, there's almost certainly police everywhere. There's definitely military. There's no Coast Guard, no R&I, no mountain rescue. So if you need extra rescue capability, and that's an identified risk, then you've got to show how you've mitigated that risk. Yeah, in any expedition where vehicles are used, vehicles are generally always the number one risk, particularly in countries with poor roads, poor driving standards, etc. If you look at the FCO, Foreign and Commonwealth Office data about how UK citizens die abroad, it's nearly always road traffic collisions. It's not snake bites, spiders, altitude, shark attacks, or nasty diseases. Yeah, what they die of is in road traffic collisions. Yeah, and that's usually not the one people guess when we're training people to go and work in remote areas. So certainly when we've worked on well-financed and high-risk expeditions for motor manufacturers, we've actually carried and been trained to use sort of cutting gear. So if there was an accident involved in one of our vehicles, we could cut someone out of it because no one else was coming to do it. There was no fire service. So that was something we'd have to be able to be equipped and manage to do. What is your evacuation system? Whatever it might be, but you need to have a plan. You need to have tried it out. Yeah, is it just, in the back of a 4x4 or a stretcher, if it's a foot carry or, whatever it might be, you need to have a plan all the way up to having, as we did have working for the UN, our sort of own fleet of available aircraft that we could utilize that were on call for us. Yeah, so whatever your plan is, yeah, you need to have an evacuation plan. And you need to plan and rehearse all elements of that plan. Never assume anyone else has done so. Yeah, make sure the plan actually can work. Yeah, test the equipment to see if it fits. Does the stuff fit in the plane? Does the stretcher fit the door of the plane? Yeah, what happens when you put something in a boat? Yeah, what monitoring is going to work? What devices have been tested to work on a plane and actually, regulated, or licensed to work on a plane? Yeah, all these sort of things. Um, you do come across some surprising stuff. One of the places we went, where we looked at United Nations major incident plan, we found their major incident supplies consisted of 50,000 diazepam tablets in a cupboard, which meant if they had had a major incident, everyone would have been given diazepam, so nobody would have cared about the major incident. But it wasn't a great plan. And medical intelligence is very important. Yeah, so an MIA, a military term for medical intelligence assessment, yeah, it should really be done by you or use a one done by a trusted provider. Definitely don't believe local government websites. They always paint a very rosy picture. Even our own government website does, for God's sake. Um, about what facilities they have there. The USA government websites reporting about other countries are pretty brutal. I mean, they probably say don't get treated on the NHS and that sort of thing. UK Foreign Commonwealth always have some reasonable information, but the American ones are pretty brutal and very realistic. So we used to use those quite a lot. And just because places have facilities just means doesn't say they can operate them. And these ambulances have been donated to this hospital in Somalia, but they had no equipment in them. They had no diesel for them. They were just sat there gathering dust, been donated by a charity, and they weren't being used. They had no way to dispatch them, no way to anything. They just had some ambulances. And try and visually inspect them yourself. When we used to go to countries, if we were planning on using a health facility, part of our build up to the event or expedition would be to actually physically go and inspect the medical facilities, go there and see them with your own eyes to see what's actually there. Certainly, one of the hospitals we went to visit that claimed to have a CT scanner. When we asked to see it, we were shown into this room, and sure enough, there was a CT scanner in hundreds of bits all over the floor because it had broken and they couldn't afford to fly the engineer from Germany to fix it. So their handyman had been trying to fix it. And we could safely say it's probably never going to work again. So there wasn't a CT scanner there. So use your own intelligence and your own eyes. What age ranges are you going to be treating? If you're away on an expedition and you come across a local child who's critically unwell, are you going to walk by? You're going to walk away? Yeah, if they've got a life-threatening condition. And these Good Samaritan acts are often not covered by your expedition insurance, which is only risk assessed the participants. You're not actually insured to treat anyone else unless you specifically had that included. So you need to be careful. Certainly on this contract, one that Rod, who's online, I know is very familiar with, we were told our medical emergency response team was only for treating adult trauma. And there we were out there RSIing a 6-year-old and flying them for medical care in the back of a UN plane, only having adult medical equipment. And the thing the arrow is pointing at is a suction catheter I made for the ET tube by fitting together a suction unit, a syringe, and a bougie that I'd cut up because we didn't have a small enough suction catheter for the ET tube. So we had to fabricate one. But also, some patients you can't evacuate out of country for political reasons. Can you cope with the ethical dilemma of that? You want to provide care, but it's just not permitted by the system, and that is, that can be ethically quite difficult for people. Assess the local risks, and and make sure you've got the right diagnostics and medications. Yeah, so you need to look at the inherent disease risk of where you're going, and make sure you're carrying the right medications to manage those risks. I say for a polar event, you probably don't need anti-malarial medications, and somewhere where there is malaria, you're unlikely to be treating frostbite. Yeah, so local risk, maybe some local learning, and they need to do in preparation to make sure you appreciate the risk of that environment and what particular conditions you might come up with. Teach others in your team. It's very common to be the medic, the solo medic. Yeah, and you might be there in a well-funded expedition with your decent medical equipment and stretchers and all this stuff. But as we know, you can't use them on your own. Yeah, so train other people in the team prior to going away to be familiar with the equipment, to be your assistant. Yeah, to know how the equipment's packed, to know how to pass you things, to know how to get stuff ready, to use the splints and that sort of thing. And of course, ultimately, the worst thing that could happen is, what if you're the casualty? Who's treating you? Who's looking after you? Yeah, so training the team could be your only defense. If you're there in a professional capacity, not necessarily paid, but definitely if you're there in a paid capacity, then you should avoid as much risk as possible. You're there to care for other people. And I've worked on expeditions where there was a whole load of fun stuff going on, mountain biking, kite buggies, all sorts of really, really fun outdoor activities that I really would have liked. And people used to think I was a really odd and that I wouldn't take part in them. And the reason was that I was getting paid to be the medic. Yeah, and I can't be the medic if I break my leg. I'm supposed to be there in case someone else breaks their leg. Yeah, so I was deliberately electing to minimize the risk to myself to protect the expedition. And if you're only medic and you're in a remote place, there's no off duty, so you should probably be sober. Yeah, unless there's more than one of you and you can take turns. Yeah, but you have a professional obligation and so on. We can risk mitigate with the clients as well. And we should take people into remote areas. We do briefings with those people. Same in remote workplaces where people have safety briefings and inductions to reduce the risk. As well as briefings, you have a safety role as well. Remind them of the reality of where they are. Sometimes you have to remind people that, we are 1,500 miles from the nearest hospital, and that's a very long way to go. And you've got to be nice about it, but sometimes you have to have rules, even if it's just getting people to drink enough water every day to minimize the risk of dehydration. Or as we were here out in Mongolia, recognizing that the big fluffy dogs by the goats were not pets. They were guard dogs. They were 50% wolf, and they'd have your arm off because they were there to protect the goats from wolves. And they were quite bitey. So please don't go and stroke the dogs. And by the way, if you get bitten by one of the dog has probably got rabies. So then we're going to fly to South Korea, and you're going to have lots of very big injections that normally kept people away from the dogs. Yeah, so you can mitigate risk in the operations that you're supplying. Realism, yeah, you have to have a very realistic mindset. Yeah, I worked on a polar race. This is actually a polar bear that we chased away from some of our teams, and it's only about 14 foot tall, so it was a medium one. Yeah, but if a couple of our teams had close encounters with polar bears, if one of the teams had been attacked by a bear and mauled, it would probably take us 5 or 6 hours to get to them by snow machine even if we could find them, because we only had intermittent tracking on them. So if they could give us their location, even still, it might take us a long time to get to them, and that might be weather dependent. So in circumstances like that, we also trained the participants, so they all had medical kits and medical training, because it would take us a long time to get to them. So you've got to appreciate the risk. Your medical malpractice insurance needs to be specific, yeah, and there's a number of things you need to make sure that you're covered for, yeah. Uh, us making a TV show with Aaron Ralston, the guy who chopped his own arm off. So he's a good man to talk to about pain scoring, and his film 127 Hours. And but if you're working with either celebrities, the loosest possible term of the word, actors, or probably worse, professional athletes and people like that, they need to have specific insurance for that. Most event medicine insurance, even in the UK, now excludes professional athletes, because if one of them gets injured and you treat them and it goes wrong, then there's a huge risk in their loss of earning status, etc., and the insurers will bear that. And likewise, if the event is in the USA or Canada or involves people from there, you will need specific insurance because they're very keen at suing and their medical costs are very expensive. Yeah, so you need specific insurance just for working with Americans. What about your guidance for death? If there's a risk of a death, what are the guidelines? Can we apply UK role guidelines in a country where, we're not a paramedic? Yeah, what are the resuscitation guidelines there? I did some training out in Thailand many years ago, and it might have changed since, but at the time, only a doctor could operate an AED. It wasn't legal in Thailand for anyone other than doctor to operate a defibrillator of any kind. Yeah, so you're going to need to be aware of local legislation. But I'm not sure anyone would fancy dealing with a dead body in a country where you don't know the law. Yeah, and I think that's something, the reality of which, you might have to face. What about other roles? Yeah, and I think this can be a good thing. What other things might you be expected to do as a remote medic? You've got to be careful about the risk of those. But yeah, here's us doing sound for a film crew because they were short of staff. And so I was twiddling the knobs on the sound thing, trying to know what I was doing. And one other big expedition I got to work on it because I had a license to drive a telehandler. I needed someone to unload some lorries. And so I think they were more excited about that than my medical CV because they didn't know how they're going to unload these lorries because no one had a license to drive the thing, and I had one. So that it can be some odd stuff. What guidelines are there out there? Yeah, I know the GMC have guidelines for remote and expedition work, particularly for students and junior doctors working in those roles where the risk might be high. Faculty of Principal Care of guidelines, the Wilderness Medical Society have guidelines. I'm not aware, and I'm more than happy to be corrected, but I'm not sure of any from the HCPC, College of Paramedics, NMC, any other sort of regulating or professional advisory body about such stuff. There probably should be something in reality. If the GMC have one, surely the others should have. Make sure you've got useful guidance with you. Yeah, accept the fact you won't have the wonders of apps and the internet that we're so used to using now, be able to tap on apps and look up guidelines and Google medical conditions you've never heard of, which I do quite regularly. Yeah. But yeah, paper publications don't fail and they don't need batteries. So certainly, I've had to resort to the Oxford Handbook of Expedition and Wilderness Medical Care when someone presented with loads of lionfish spines in their hand. And I was like, oh, that's not something I've seen before. Where's that book? Yeah, sure enough, in there, it told me what to do about it. But it's a great gig. Yeah, don't be put off by all this stuff. I don't want to put people off the idea of, remote or expedition medicine. It's just about having your eyes open to the risk so you're well prepared and then you enjoy it more because you'll be ready for anything that happens. And things do happen sometimes. We've dealt with some quite seriously unwell and injured people in remote places, and we were well prepared for it. So that's what matters. Well, we reached the end and we're running fairly nicely on time. Yeah. So I thank you for your attention.